Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Lowry, and I'm here with my friends Mo and Heather, and we're going to be talking about doodling and the basics of doodling using 7 really simple shapes that anybody can draw. So Mo and Heather, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through. And so,
okay,
give me a second to get the, of course, it didn't start at the beginning. So doodling basics, we're going to talk about how to get started so that anybody can doodle, and you can, while you're on the phone, you can doodle, or if you want to doodle, while you're just for relaxation or to make art, any of that. So 7 basic shapes. So the 7 basic shapes are something anybody can draw. Circles and ovals is one of the shapes. Of course, that's 2 shapes, but it's one category of shapes. And then squares and rectangles.
okay,
Triangles. Leaves. Hearts. Paisley patterns. And stars. So just off the bat, do those sound like shapes that you think you could draw?
Yes.
Yes, hearts. I'm really not very good at hearts. It looks like a bum. All right, sorry. Paisleys. Oh,
We'll talk about how to do that. So,
okay.
So doodling's not rocket science, and you can't get it wrong. So this is a cool little rocket from the NASA website. I thought, hey, that's really cool. So we're going to talk about circles and ovals.
Okay.
So a cool exercise is to create a bunch of the same shape and then fill it in different ways. So for example, here I've got, a whole bunch of circles on the top. I've started adding other circles so that they all kind of have the same beginning shape.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to fill your shapes with things like lines and dots and swirls and squiggles and other shapes, some of the other basic shapes.
Okay.
And then you're going to add some contrast. So what the contrast does is it gives your eye somewhere to land. So especially when you have a lot of things on the page, adding some contrast helps your eye know where to look next.
Okay.
And you can add contrast by varying the line width. You can also add darker areas of contrast by using some solid areas, some cross hatching, some circles or dots, lines that are close together, lines that overlap. So here's our basic circles, and they're filled in all different ways. So you can see with this, I'm gonna bring up my little laser pointer. So you can see here, they all started this way. And then I filled them in different ways. So one of the things that I found is when you fill in solid areas, you can fill in solids like here so that it's really black, and like here where it's really black, or you can fill it into where you have lines that overlap. So some of the white still shows through, or some of the background color still shows through. And you can also cross hatch it. And again, that's so some of the background shows through. So it gives it a solid area, but not quite as dense of a solid area. And it adds just a little bit more texture to it. So you can see, there's different ways that I filled in using the same basic shape, but used, some half circles, some lines, some dots, some swirls, some lines with some texture, extra lines in it. You can angle your lines. We added some triangles with some extra lines on the inner circle. Some little half circles, and then circles within circles, and then making kind of a variation of a circle with a petal. So making the edge kind of jagged so it makes more of a petal shape. You can also, with your circles, or with any of the shapes, you can have them centered within each other, or you can have them so that the sides abut one another. So it kind of creates an asymmetrical area. So here we have circles that are up against the edge with other circles coming out, that gives it just a different feeling. And then here we have half circles that are overlapped. So it creates little areas that you could then fill in if you wanted to, or just shapes that add more interest to your shape. And this one is a longer petal, again, that overlaps. So it creates some shapes that you can do something else within. You can add some extra texture, or you can add different colors to it.
Cool.
One of the things that I like to do that you'll see lots of examples are is I like to give myself areas that I can fill in. So like here I made the shape, and then I made little circles, and then I made the half petals. But then I started adding some shapes on the outside. And then once I had those shapes, then I created a outline around the whole thing, which gave me, if I was coloring this in, I would have, this area I could color, or I could color in the little shapes. And then I added another line around the outside. So it starts to give you more breadth to your shape that you started with, but it also gives you places that you can fill in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, it's cool. Yeah.
So here's an example of circles that I started. If you look at this kind of in half, so I started the circles, and then I started drawing shapes, and then this side on the left, I continued to fill them in. So if you see, this shape is the same as this shape. This one is more filled in than this one is. So with your doodles, you can obviously use whatever colors you want. You can do it with one color, you can do it with kind of a monochromatic color, or you can create a family of colors. So with this one, I used basically 2 shades of yellow, an orange, and a red. So you can see here, this bright yellow is actually a highlighter yellow that I often use a lot of highlighters because they're bright and they're kind of transparent. So you can put things over top of them, and they don't get real muddy. And then I had kind of a mustard yellow that I added. And then this orange is kind of, going toward red, but it's in the similar kind of family. And then I used a brighter red that was a smaller pen. So I had different line widths to work with as well. So that's kind of an interesting exercise too, is to kind of see what you can start, and then what you can add on to it. And you can layer things together. So you can see here I had kind of the orangish yellow, but then I layered a line on top of it that was, maybe even a brown. I can't remember if that was a different shade of brown, or if it was just a different shade of orange, a smaller pen, but I added some texture on top of it.
Vanessa, do you start with a pen, or do you start with a pencil, or does it vary?
It varies. Sometimes if I'm going to color it in, sometimes I actually start with a highlighter. So if you draw with a highlighter, then you can easily layer color on top of it. Where if you start with a pencil and then put color on top of it, the pencil doesn't always erase very well.
Yeah.
If you're using markers. And if you're using colored pencils and you go on top of a pencil, it usually will cover it up. So you can play with different things. Sometimes I do use pencil and am going over it with just a marker that's like a black marker, and then it covers it up and I can erase whatever lines are still there. So one thing I also do is, if I'm drawing little circles, I draw them by hand, but if I'm drawing bigger circles, you can use, cups and plates and bowls and that kind of thing to get your shapes of your bigger circles. So that makes it easy to make, a very symmetrical circle if you want to. You can obviously, do it by hand as well. It's just harder to get a more symmetrical circle by hand if you haven't practiced a lot at it.
Yeah. For sure.
And you don't have to always have things symmetrical. I like things that are asymmetrical too. So it just depends on what you're going for. So here's a whole bunch of examples of different things you can do with circles. You can make a lot of borders. You can create kind of patterns that then you use in different areas of your piece, probably on the edges somewhere. You can layer circles together. You can also make swirls that are kind of in the circle family that aren't exactly circles. But I use those a lot because I think they're fun to draw, they're fun to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also, use some straight lines with half circles on them, and then even add extra details within the circles.
Mm.
And you can use curvy lines and use the circles as kind of a decorative thing between the, in the empty spots of the curves.
Mm.
And you can stretch them out to make them really long. I do a lot of flowers too, so you can stretch them out and make really long petals or really long, shapes to use.
Very cool.
So this is a example again of the spirals. So you can have spirals that are, pretty evenly symmetrical, but you can also, I think there's kind of a beauty to really asymmetrical spirals too. So you can make really messy spirals
Mm-hmm.
that create some interest too. So again, it depends on what you're going for, and you can mix them together and you can have them connect to one another.
I love that one.
It's really cool.
Thanks.
I love that one.
And see, this is an example of using a highlighter. So this is a green highlighter and then just with black. So, highlighters I think are really versatile because you can use them, you can draw over top of them. You can also use them to color in areas. So
Okay.
So this is another example of a highlighter, but this is one that I wanted to have really kind of drawn out in detail because I was going to color it. And I wanted it to be kind of an earth. And so I used this pattern of the continents. Again, I used bowls, plates and bowls. So I drew my circles. So this circle,
Mm-hmm.
and one tip when you're using bowls and plates is draw your biggest one first. Position it on the page and draw your biggest one first.
Mm.
And then your smaller ones go in next. So that way you can center them or position them. You can accurately position them wherever you want them to be.
Yeah.
But if you do the smaller one first, it's almost impossible to tell where to put the other one. So just a little tip from that standpoint.
Good.
So
tip.
with this one, I drew everything in a blue highlighter. And then this is what it looked like once it was all colored in.
Ooh. Oh my God.
So you can see almost all of the blue is covered up, but it was dark enough that I could see what I was doing. But then, I could go over it with other colors and it pretty much covered it up. You can still see a little bit of the blue highlighter on this outer line. And here in these little circles here, you can see the blue highlighter.
So did you have an idea of what the finished product might look like when you started?
I knew that I wanted this one. I had more of an idea for this one than I usually do.
Mhm.
I knew that I wanted it to be an earth type of thing. And so I wanted it to be kind of mandala-ish, but a kind of an earth. And
Mhm.
so that was one of the reasons I did such a detailed highlighter sketch to begin with. And so then once I colored it in, I just started coloring. And of course, these are all colors that I like and that I use a lot. So, I kind of varied where I worked, but kind of picked a color pattern. And then, once I picked a color pattern on the outside, I did the whole thing. And once I picked a color pattern for this line, then I did that whole thing. So,
Mhm.
and then I don't remember if I did the circles. I imagine I probably did the circles one of the last things because, I wanted to pull in some of these colors into the middle part as well.
Mm.
It's so pretty.
Mm.
Thank you. That was fun to do. They're all fun to do, but the other thing about using highlighters is you can also use highlighters and then cover over them, like draw over them with other lines and stuff to tone them down. Like the yellow highlighter is usually pretty bright. And I think I probably then took another highlighter or another marker that was just a little shade darker and went over it to tone it down just a little bit.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
So another thing that's fun to do is like this was in my sketchbook and I took several, it looks like I had 3 different colored markers that were kind of in the light shade and created just a pattern of color in the back. And then took a black marker and did the doodle on top of that.
Mm.
So, you know, it didn't really have a lot of structure to it other than I just wanted to create some shapes of colors in the background, and then started drawing my flowers and my circles on top of it, and it just kind of expanded from there.
Yeah, it's a great three-dimensional feel to it.
It looks like a window.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it
It's
was
like a window.
it was something that, you know, created a lot of color without having as much time as if I was going to color in every flower individually. You know, it was just a
Mhm.
big swatch of color. And if you
Mhm.
were going to paint a background or something, that would be a great way to start too, is to paint the background and then draw over top of it. So,
Mhm. Mm.
so especially when I first started doing a lot of doodling, I did a lot of mandalas and still do them some because they're fun to do. And there's all different ways you can do them. So this was one where I drew the center one with my highlighter. So you can see, you know, the lines here
Mhm.
with the highlighter. So even though the lines still showed, I think it just adds a little bit of extra interest to it. I don't think it takes away from the whole piece at all. So I drew, and you can see there's a highlighter line here. And then I'm sure there was a highlighter line here that then I drew over top of. And then I drew these shapes and drew shapes in the middle of them, and then kind of expanded it from there and decided as I was going along to make these two kind of similar, you know, kind of a flip version of one another.
Uh-huh.
While the center one is really kind of the anchor of it, but these two on the sides are a little bit more similar to one another.
Hmm.
And then the hearts and the swoops and the swirls out here are really just to fill the rest of the shape.
So it seems like you're making your own Rorschach tests or something. I mean, does it have a your subconscious sort of emerging feel to it? This
It very well could. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. You know, it kind of just, usually when I'm doodling, I don't have much of a plan of where it's going to go, because I'm doing it as a kind of a relaxation for my brain.
Mhm. Yeah.
Most of my work that I do is very precise and pre-planned, and, you know, has to fit certain client parameters. And so usually when I'm doodling, it's just to kind of give my brain a break and let it go wherever it wants to go, and then see what happens with it. So,
Oh.
and you can see here, you know, different lines making, you know, some of the backgrounds like we were talking about. You can have solid shapes, or you can make up semi-solid shapes with, you know, lines that are close together, or these are little circles that are close together.
Mm-hmm.
The added benefit of that too is that it kind of heightens the meditative aspect of doodling, because you're kind of doing the same thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not particularly fast, but it's something that you kind of get into a groove and a flow of letting your hand kind of do the same thing as your brain kind of takes a break.
Mm.
So I was going to ask you, how long this was so much detail. How long would something like this take you?
I really couldn't tell you.
That's good. You've lost time. That's good.
And usually it's like something like this, I typically wouldn't do it all at one time.
Yeah.
You know, things that are one color obviously go faster than things that are multiple colors, but something like this, I usually start it and then would do it over several days or several different doodling sessions. So
yeah.
So that was circles and ovals. So now we're going to go to squares and rectangles. And again, you can do the same thing where you have, you know, shapes, and then you fill them in with different things in the middle. One of the things that I found about squares is that I typically use squares and rectangles more as frames. There's not all that often that I use them actually as details within a doodle, although I do sometimes. So, you know, like this is a little pattern or a little overlap, this is kind of cool with kind of a basket weave. And so
Mhm.
I'm just doing the shading on opposite sides with each one. So it kind of creates a little bit of a dimension of a basket weave kind of thing.
Hmm.
And you can also turn your squares on the sides, so it makes little diamond shapes, which is, kind of gives it a different feeling and a different aspect. So when I first started teaching the doodling classes, I made an example for each of the basic shapes. So this was the doodle that I created for squares.
Hmm.
And as I was working on it, of course, it's got a lot of triangles in it too. As I was working on it, I realized that I really don't enjoy doing all straight lines.
Oh yeah.
So I had to throw in a few curves because it was just like too many straight lines. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to know about myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this, and right here, you can see this is an example of some colors layered on top of each other. So this was like yellow highlighter that then had a little green line and a little orange line laid on top of it. And then here I had the yellow, but I made the orange more solid on top of it with the little green line. So you can, like, again, with markers, you can layer things together to get kind of a translucent effect to change the colors and the textures a little bit.
Hmm.
And here's some more squares. You can combine them together to create patterns. You can have them touch or you can have them separated. You can make borders out of them. You can have squares within squares, like you can have a straight square and then a diamond square in the middle. You can have squares that kind of go back into a dimension.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a spiral that's more of a square, so it feels more yang to the yin that's a more circular swirl.
Huh.
And then you can have, like the other shapes, you can have squares that intersect with one another and squares that overlap one another.
Hmm.
So here's an example of squares that are overlapping. And then here's an example of a similar thing in color. So this was a piece of colored paper and then colored pencils on top of it. So, that's kind of fun from the standpoint of you can do a lot of things with color on color when you're working with colored pencils, because you can use colored paper with the colored pencils on top of it.
Hmm.
And you could use markers on top of the colored paper too. It just wouldn't sit up on top of the paper as much. It would more soak into the paper. And so your lines would be more fuzzy and the colors would be more subdued. So you can play with different kinds of medium that you want to work with.
Yeah.
And so this was fun because I had gotten a new pack of gel pens that had a bunch of different colors in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to make a bunch of squares. And so you can see in my pattern, I'm using a similar look, but I'm not, I'm letting it be messy. I'm not really concerned about making it exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
The yellows were kind of suns, but they were not exactly the same part of the sun.
Hmm.
I had little leaves that, there were 3 there and 2 there. So, and then I used a watercolor in the background, and then a little marker just kind of as a shadow, but I kind of like the effect of the messiness of it. So,
Yeah.
Again, I think you don't have to worry about things being perfect. I think, kind of the messiness part of things is what makes stuff interesting sometimes too.
Yeah. Like I can see your eye here, that shows up in your simple black and white photography, all of those little patterns that you pick up on.
Yeah.
He walks around the neighborhood and everything. It's just like, yeah, as your eye shifts and you come up with these different frames, I mean, it speaks to my photographer language.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that you would notice that, because I think, especially as my background as a graphic designer, but then as a doodler, I do notice patterns a lot. And that's kind of where it becomes interesting to be able to repeat things, is once you see a pattern and then being able to repeat it or vary it a little bit with different things.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And so these are squares, but they're kind of on a perspective. So it's kind of distorted. And again, I mentioned that a lot of times I use squares just as framework, but this is an example of one that I used pencil underneath it to kind of make sure that I had my squares where I wanted them to be, and to figure out how I wanted this letter to go in and out of the frame. And then used a black micron pen over top of it, and then was able to erase my pencil lines.
Yes.
And then used all these little squares just to fill in, different things. So it was kind of a fun, first of the year manifest type of theme. So
I'm in awe. This is really fun.
cool. So does it feel like that these are shapes that you feel like that you all could do, that you can play with?
Well, yeah, in the beginner version of that.
Well, sure.
Yeah. Very cool.
But anytime you start anything, it's the beginner version.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so our next shape is a triangle. So we had circles and ovals, squares and rectangles, and now we're going to triangles. So again, you could draw a bunch of triangles and then fill them in different ways. Triangles are fun because you can fit them together in different ways. They kind of fit together, the sides, you can flip them over and fit them together. You can put them on ends and fit them together, or put the flat sides together. You can create little mountain shapes where you have the flat sides all on one side. And of course, the triangles don't have to all be even-sided triangles either. So there's lots of opportunities. I tend to use triangles a lot for patterns and borders. So, if I have things that I need some sort of border at the bottom, I can create lines, and then I can have my triangles on the top and the bottom line with something else in the middle, or I can have the triangle, every other shape with a different shape, kind of rounding it out. So I find that triangles are fun to use as patterns. And then here's some additional, patterns with circles, making the triangles with circles, using lines to make kind of a triangular shape.
Yeah.
Using a sun and making the rays of the sun out of triangles. You can either use just lines to make, like, this is kind of a bookcase feel, but you can use lines that kind of create more of a modern triangle, a very clean line, very minimalist kind of triangle. And you can even make the edges of your triangle be curved so that you make more of a fan type of thing, which is kind of what this is, as opposed to a really straight triangle. Again, I think that's me not wanting to have everything all straight lines. It's like, how can I make this curvy? So this is a picture of a quilt that my mom has in her kitchen.
Oh.
So when I was up there in early November, I had my sketchbook and I was looking for things to do. And I thought, well, this would be kind of an inspiration. And really, quilts are a great thing to look at for inspiration for doodles, because they're already simplified patterns. And so you can kind of get all kinds of cool ideas by looking at quilt pictures. So you can see this is triangles that are sewn together to make squares. And then they're sewn together to make, lines of squares, and then on and on. So what I did is I did this in my sketchbook, and you can see these lines are very straight. So I used to, I measured out the width because I wanted it to look symmetrical.
Yeah.
And I used straight lines to draw my lines. And as I was starting to draw these, I decided maybe I would just do the actual triangles in every other one, because they were taking a long time. So then I made up this other pattern to be in the alternate squares. But you can see I created several different patterns. So we've got a pattern here that's repeated here, that's repeated here, that's repeated here. Same thing with the stars. We've got the same stars here that are here, and then a different kind of star that's here. So I created several patterns and then just kind of went around the page and kept filling in squares filling in the different triangles as I went along
Hmm.
until I finally had it done. This one took forever. I was like, I don't know if it's ever going to be done. And so you can see here, triangles that are fit together. This is an example of, kind of a stack of triangles that are similar, but then I did the colors opposite. So you can see, how different it looks just to have the same stack, but changing up the colors to just kind of switch the variation of colors.
Hmm.
And down here, I did a pattern with triangles, but every other one I did, triangle and triangle, and every other one I did a circle. So again, it's kind of creates a cohesiveness, but it's not all exactly the same.
Hmm.
And these are leaves that would be can be leaves or flowers, but if you look at ivies are kind of triangular shapes. So you can make kind of ivy type of leaves out of triangles.
Hmm.
So several years ago, I published a coloring book. And so this was one of the pages from my coloring book. And I wanted to make this page to feel kind of masculine and more straight lined. And so I used a lot of triangles for borders. And here I made triangles out of kind of a herringbone. So you can see that every other line stops on top of the one that's adjacent to it. And then creating some borders out of triangles that were, you can see they're not totally symmetrical, but they're kind of symmetrical. So it's, visually gives a lot of symmetry, while in reality, everything's not exact. Some things were measured out, but not every single thing was measured out. I'm a big fan of tracing around things to get big shapes. So I had a square box that was rounded corners. So I used the lid to make a big triangle shape on this piece of paper. And so that was kind of the way I started this one, was with that big triangle shape, and then added things on top of it. And of course, triangles make great evergreen trees and great Christmas trees. So Mo, this is an example of one of the spreads from that sketchbook project that we were talking about before we started recording the call. So this is sketchbookproject.com is the site, and they're a nonprofit that anybody can get a sketchbook from them. You can fill it in however you want, and they have some prompts that you can follow, or you can do your own thing. And then you can submit it to them, and it goes into the Brooklyn Art Library's permanent exhibit. And you can also have it in their digital library. So anybody that wants to can go to the sketchbookproject.com, and they can access the digital library and put in my name, Vanessa Lowry, and see my full sketchbook, which is cool. I think that's really cool that people can check it out that way. So now we're going to go to leaves. So we're to shape number 4. Do you guys have any questions as we're going along?
It's really cool though. Keep
Okay.
I love leaves. It's just interesting to me the different emotions of the different shapes. Like you're saying, you're drawn more to the circular than the square. Yeah, I felt that as you were going through them. I want to draw squiggly things.
Yeah, I do some straight lines, but for the most part, I do a lot of curves. So, and the funny thing was, I remember having that conversation with one of my best friends, and she's like, "Really? Should I like straight lines?" I'm like, "Really? I would have never thought that about you."
Oh,
so, go figure.
Are we making a judgment of what that means?
No, I just
people compared to the curved people.
I know. I was like, oh, I guess I was. I guess I unintentionally was. So, so there's the fun thing about leaves is they're all kind of different shapes, and even really basic leaf shapes like these, you can fill them in lots of different ways. So leaves are fun to do. Again, you can do borders with leaves. I love doing these kind of curvy lines with the leaves on them. I think that, makes some cool borders on things. You can also make, more substantial borders with leaves. And you can, with leaves, you can have things that are asymmetrical leaves. You can also have, if you look outside and at plants and shrubs, some of them have very symmetrical leaves. So, there's some of them you can have, things that are very symmetrical. Some are really bushy, some like more of a bamboo kind of thing are very sparse as far as the number of leaves that go with the stems. There's vines that you can do with, so you can add, make a swirl and add leaves to it. It makes it feel like a vine.
Wow.
Oak leaves are very forgiving because, if in nature, if you look at an oak leaf tree, there's all kinds of different shapes of leaves on an oak leaf tree. An oak tree has ones that are, lots of different shapes of the same thing. And some of them are very symmetrical and a lot of them are not. And then some have just a few little curves on them on the same tree. So you can really do a lot of different shapes that still give you that sense of an oak leaf. And again, we were talking about ivies, you can do triangles that give you kind of an ivy, more of a modernistic type of look. And these are fun that are stems that have curved leaves on them. And you can either make these symmetrical or you make them asymmetrical, but then you can create spaces on the inside that you can fill in either all the same or you can fill them in all different. So it makes for a lot of interesting imagination things that you can do with leaves that way. And you can see here an example of, when I'm talking about having spaces, if you create extra lines either on the inside or the outside, it gives you spaces visually for your eye to not have everything run together, but it also gives you a way to add some extra thick lines. So you can see some of the contrast here with some extra thick lines on the outside. And like this extra swirl at the bottom, I've got some extra thick lines. So it kind of gives your eye some places to look at without it all just jumbling together. So here's an example of where these were all just a single color. And so with the single color, you really have to leave some blank space for your eye to have a break and to be able to see what's going on. And when you're using color, you just have to do that with different values of color. So you can have some really dark shades kind of butting up against lighter shades or against brighter shades so that your eye can see what's going on without it having to have as much white areas. And one of the things that I try to tell people is if when you're doing a doodle, if you come up against something that you think is a mistake, try to hang with it for a little while. And maybe you can find that there's a way to salvage it. So like when I was doing this leaf, I used yellow highlighter here and it was just way too bright. And I thought, okay, well, that's not going to work. So then I added circles on top of it and then colored behind the circles. And then I really liked how they kind of glowed, how I created a area that was a little bit of bright, but with a darker area behind it. So what I try to tell people is if you feel like you've made a mistake, there's a couple of different things you can do. You can repeat it and then it creates a pattern. You can draw on top of it. So that's what I did here is I drew on top of it. So that kind of masked it a little bit. You can also make it, while I said you can repeat it, then you can also draw it in multiple places on your page. So it creates, it looks like it's intentional that way. It's not necessarily a pattern, but it looks like it's intentional because you did it in multiple places. And then if you still really hate it, then you can always just throw it away. Do something and cut it up and do something else with it.
Yeah.
So this is another example of, again, I said, here with color, things can butt up against each other because you've got different values of color. Here's another example of using a little bit of contrast with some texture and then a combination with white space so that your eye can tell what's going on without it all jumbling together. And the other thing is, here's an example of a mistake. So I drew some little circles that were too close together and I just drew over top of them. And you can still see it a little bit, but when you look at the whole thing, you don't really notice that.
Yeah.
So most people are not going to see things that you see as mistakes. Can you all see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you start with the birds? How did you?
No, I started with this shape, these shapes in the middle, but this was an example of one that I did use some pencil, and because I'd seen this idea of these kind of leaf shapes. And so I wanted to do that. And then I had another idea that was a kind of a bird shape. So I knew I wanted to do leaves and birds.
Mm.
So I drew some, some lines as far as to give myself some parameters here. And I wanted it to be pretty symmetrical. And then I drew the shape of the bird, and I knew I wanted them to overlap. And so so I had the leaf shapes, the circles, and the birds that I drew in pencil. And then I went from there and drew over top of it.
Mm.
These birds are amazing.
So the cool thing about leaves too is that you can actually trace around leaves out in your yard. So probably not at this time of year, especially where you are, where there's snow everywhere. But in the summer, when things have leaves on them, just being very careful not to get poison ivy or things that, are going to make you break out. But you can pick different leaves out of your yard. And as long as your paper's big enough, you can lay them on the paper and actually trace around them. So you can see here, I used my bowl and my plate and made 2 circles. And then I laid my leaves and traced around my leaves, and then went back in and started filling it in with colors. The other thing about markers is you can get different tips on your markers. So I had some markers that were more brush tips or chisel tips, so they were wider.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had other ones that were thinner to work with and could do smaller details. So, you don't have to have ones with different tips, but it gives you more flexibility if you have a couple of different tips. And so this is the finished,
Ooh.
the finished leaves, and you can see, it's quite vibrant as far as the way it all kind of came together. But this green here is a highlighter green, which is the same here. The yellow is a highlighter yellow. But then I toned it down with some orange on top of it. So you can see it kind of tones it down a little bit. And I don't remember if this pink was a highlighter pink and I did red over top of it, or if it was just a lighter pink. So now hearts. So Mo, this is you getting a lesson in how to draw hearts. So I particularly like to draw hearts, and part of that is because years ago, one of my friends, said to me, you can focus on the things that you fear, or you can focus on the things that you love. And I have found that to be a really valuable lesson for me. And my tendency is to be kind of a worrier. And so if I focus on the things that I fear, it just kind of goes down into a big spiral that way.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can get myself to focus on the things that I love as much of the time as I can, I find that I'm more productive, and I think that I'm more valuable to my community that way, my family and my community. And I also think it makes life more interesting to focus on the things that you love. So several years ago, I published a coloring book, and my coloring book the title was Love Coloring. And so it was all on the theme of kind of focusing on the things that you love and using that as a theme throughout the coloring book. And I think hearts are fun. They're very versatile, and I think they're fun to draw. And you can see, you can create all kinds of different shapes with a heart. This is a heart that doesn't really connect at the top, but it still creates a really interesting heart shape. So you can have, the tops be 2 different curves. You can have them connect. You can have them not connect. You can add different layers on it. You can have them in the center of things with, stuff around them. Again, you can make them be leaves. You can make them be flower petals. I draw a lot of butterflies. You can make them be part of
Mm.
the petal, the petals, the wings of the butterflies, or the details within the butterflies. They're also really fun to kind of stack around each other, on top of each other, around each other.
Mm.
You can make the tops, like I said, you can make the tops not touch. You can make the tops kind of a loop at the top so they do touch. I'm a fan of adding an extra line around things. I think it adds extra interest when you add extra lines around things.
Mm.
And you can also create, a border that then has lines, which gives you almost a stained glass kind of feel
Mm.
to hearts or other shapes as well. And so here's an example of a butterfly that started with heart shapes. So you can see there's a heart here, and then there's another line around the outside with the heart. And then I added this extra little point at the end on the bottom of the wing, just for an added interest. And then there's hearts in the middle, as part of the decoration. So
Mm.
it creates kind of you can create cool butterflies with hearts.
Yeah.
And my name Vanessa actually means butterfly. And so I like to incorporate butterflies into things too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You probably said that before, but we talked about green goo a lot in Taos, about that transformation. I didn't realize that we were talking about the embodiment of you, though. I mean, as far as you are the embodiment of the butterfly.
That's right. That's right.
Finished version.
Well, and Sue Monk Kidd, one of her books, she talks about the green goo, the stage of the butterfly, that's the green goo stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had forgotten that we talked about that in Taos too.
Yeah.
So, again, hearts can stack on top of each other. You can create flowers out of them. You can, smush them together really easily.
Hmm.
Here's some that are stacked, and then there's smaller hearts that they fit into, small shapes nice. They're great for filling in with when you've got a swirl and then you need a little something on the edge. It's cool to fill it in with a little heart or a little circle.
Hmm.
And here they are stacked on the sides again with extra space around it to create visually some space. But, this is an example of just a ballpoint pen, working with just a ballpoint pen. So, so Paisley, this is the one that you weren't really sure about. So, so Paisleys can be round at the bottom. So really it's just one end is smaller than the other end. And it's kind of an amoeba type of shape. But it can be round at the bottom, or it can be really pointy at the bottom. So here it's more of a teardrop type of thing, or it can be pointy at the bottom with a curve. So that way it, creates kind of you've got a variety of different shapes.
Mm.
And they fit together really well. So if you wanted to have multiple ones, you can fit, the round part, the big round part of the curve closer to a smaller round part in another one.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can have them, the ends kind of, you can play with having them fit around each other.
Mm. Mm.
And you can even create kind of a fountain look with multiple, so it's more of like a water splash, water droplet kind of look.
That's cool.
So when you have the pointy end, you can also create little swirls on the end. So Heather, you can see me with my little curves again, wanting to add little swirls wherever I can. And so here's an example of kind of a water droplet. I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I love how you split up that flower. I mean, it looks like you split up that flower between the paisley and the circle.
Hmm.
So fun.
And I don't think I consciously thought of it as the same flower, but I can see where it looks that way.
It looks like a mirror even.
Mm-hmm.
A mirror almost.
Yeah, so it's kind of a similar flower, but yeah. And it is cool to see how people see things, with any art, people see art how they see it, based on their own visual and their own experience, which may or may not have anything to do with what the artist was thinking about when they did it.
Yeah.
So you can see here's an example of paisleys that are kind of fit together, to kind of create a cool, interesting shape with different colors. And again, this is colored pencil on top of colored paper. And Prismacolor pencils, I think, are just wonderful. So they're fun to play with. And so you can see you can fill in Paisleys with all kinds of different shapes and patterns and create different looks that way. And here's an example of what started out as a mandala, but then, you know, I did Paisleys over top of it, which kind of made it playful and fun and kind of expanding out of itself. And with more hearts, you know, hearts on top of the Paisleys.
Yeah.
And then stars. When I was working on when I was first putting this class together, I decided that there needed to be something else. And I find that I don't use stars a lot, but they are really handy to use sometimes. So, and there's lots of different ways you can do stars. You know, you can do the star where you make the triangular shape and then the, you know, cross shape. I'm not explaining that very well, but you can kind of see what I'm doing with the pointer there. And then you can either fill it in, or if you did it in pencil, you could erase those cross shapes. You can also do it where you have two triangles that fit on top of each other to make a six-sided star. You can have curvy triangles that make a six-sided star, but that has a little more movement to it. You can also make a diamond shape and then have triangles that fit off of the sides and in the areas in between to make kind of a multi-dimensional star. And then these were four-sided stars layered on top of each other. So, you know, if you wanted to try to, you know, you could either do a circle and do the triangles on top of it, each of the edges, and then twist it and do the next one and do the next one. So, and then you can do kind of starburst, you know, you can do kind of multiple points for stars. One of the things that makes really cool backgrounds too is to make these little stars that are just basically a cross shape with then an X on top of it with then little starbursts on top of that. So it makes great for just filling in a background. Again, you can make, you know, patterns with the stars, curvy shapes with the little, you know, little pointy edges stars. This was a combination of circles and hearts and stars and, you know, several kinds. And then, you know, kind of a starfish shape thing that was more curvy and had a little bit more dimension to it. So this is an example of some of those six-sided curvy stars out of triangles that then I just let the lines show and yet that be kind of a design element and then filled it in from there. And this was another example of, you know, a lighter color in the background and then going over top of it with a darker color to create this texture of a circle background. This was a card that I designed on, I used to do this create and commune when I was doing classes at the Episcopal Church. And so once a month, I would just for a couple hours hang out and bring markers, and whoever wanted to show up would show up, and we would draw together and I would have coloring pages. And so this was one that I did close to the 4th of July. And so, you know, basically it was really simple with just some lines and then a star with a little pattern in the background, a little cupcake, and then some lettering to say Happy 4th of July.
Cute. I want a cupcake now, though.
Hey, I understand that. And so this was an example of kind of a star shape, but it kind of gave it a little bit of a Moroccan feel where it was more of a flower, you know, a circle that started with, you know, kind of petals, curvy petals, and then extra lines around it, and then added lines in the background with some stars. I'm sure I did the stars and then the background part. So
that looks like
an example of one of those that grows.
It looks like yarn or something. I mean, it is so amazing.
Three-dimensional.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. So you can see here, I used those little simple stars as just an added texture that gave it a little bit of color in these wider shapes, but didn't really take over much. So that's all the shapes. Now we're going to talk about a couple of ways that you can start. There's lots of different ways to start, but one of the ways is with one big shape. Another way is with a scribble. So
I'm gonna get a bowl or a plate or something.
So this is an example of, using a plate to make the base circle, and then I did some other plates on top of it, or some other bowls on top of it. And then a scribble can just be, you put your line down on the page and scribble around. So, after we did that trip to Taos, those cards that I started doing at first were kind of based on this idea, where I would start with scribbles and then I would fill it in and then kind of manipulate it from there. So one big shape, talking about how to start. So here's, the plate, and then a smaller bowl on top of it. And so for this one, I decided I didn't want it to be centered. I wanted it to be, attached to the bottom of the circle. And then I drew a pencil line in the middle because I wanted to, have something that was kind of centered in the middle of that circle. So, did a shape around the smaller circle, did a heart, added another line around the heart, and then kind of added these other shapes from there. This is further along. So here in the background, I actually measured out, because I wanted to have, I wanted it to be pretty symmetrical on this one. This was going to be a coloring page, and I wanted this to be pretty symmetrical. So when I scanned it, it would be really square to the page. So I measured out, the width for these thin lines, and then the line in between, and then used a straight edge to make my lines. And so that was the finished. But you can see when I was doing the chevron pattern, I did those by hand because it didn't really matter if they lined up to the edge of the page. I kind of like that juxtaposition of the really straight and with the more hand-drawn. I tend to like the hand-drawn with things that are hand-drawn so that they look like they're hand-drawn.
Yeah.
So pretty.
And so this is kind of another, going back to the mandalas with the circles, this was kind of a mandala piece. At the time I was working with a client that did a lot of water treatment. They made machines for water treatment. And so I was, taking a break from some of their stuff. So I decided to do something that felt like water, felt like a water related thing. So I knew that I was just going to use a variety of blues with maybe a little bit of other color, but started out with the circles. So I did 1, 2, 3 circles, and then found my center point and started drawing these kind of Paisley water droplet shapes. And then, more, one in between those, then little shapes around the outside, and then did a line around the whole outside of that. And then just filled in to my outer circle from that line. Does that make sense? And so this was the next stage here. I mean, I didn't take pictures all along the way. I just took some pictures, but this was, another stage of that. And then for this outer line, I used more of a brush stroke marker to make kind of this wave on the outside edge, and then made these little messy spirals that connected to one another. So one line connects to the other and then continues to make the spirals. So those make, that's kind of a fun thing to do and makes a fun pattern in the background. And then you can see I used a little bit of yellow and a little bit of green just to kind of balance out the monochromatic blue that was going on. This is another example of a different mandala. So you can see I don't have as much filled in with this. My mom's an artist, and she primarily does watercolors. So one time when I was up there, I asked her if she had any like watercolor paper that she had started something on that she hadn't finished. And so she had just some background stuff that she'd done. So this was just a background with some different shades of color that she was playing with wet on wet stuff. And so then I did this doodle on top of it. So it was kind of a collaborative doodle with my mom, which was fun. So this is another example of one shape. So I did this big kind of a triangular flower with another flower on the bottom. So this was kind of my first shape that I started with, and then filled in things around it to expand out, to make the additional shapes and the addition, to fill in the background. So you can see these flowers are all very similar as far as the way that they're drawn, but there's just a few different colors and then a few different sizes. And this bright green is a highlighter green. I really like the shade of highlighter green. I think it's a cool green. So your hands make a great thing to trace around. So, you can make cool things with your hand. This was one that was a fairly recent one I've got this purple sketchbook that's almost finished. So I've been close to the end with it. So this was, just tracing my hand and then making the background more busy, but keeping the hand pretty open with just a little bit of dimension as far as creating a little bit of texture. And these are just little circles creating this shading on the edge of the fingers. Now this, I'm showing you this as another example of hands. So this one, of course, is much more complex and much busier, but these were both. So I outlined one hand and outlined the other hand. And then I did a scribble on top of it. And then I did little circles with, I think it was, juice glass and a shot glass. I just did a variety of circles. And then I had all kinds of shapes to fill in. So then I could decide what I wanted to fill in. And with the hands, what I decided to do was, you can see that the pattern that I created is the same pattern on both hands, but it's different colors. So this one's much more, reds and purples and some green. And then this one is a lighter with some yellows, and, the greens are not as dark and with more lavenders and that kind of thing. So and even with the circle parts in the fingers, it's the same pattern, but it's different colors. And I thought that created kind of a cohesiveness to it, but yet it was very different in the way the color treatments are.
Wow.
So
I
cool.
love that one.
So cool.
I want to talk to you later about if it's possible to buy a print of that or something. That would be
absolutely
so cool in their gallery.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have a cafe press store, and I've got some versions of this and that, but we can talk about whatever size you want to do too. So
I love that one.
So then starting with the scribble. So, that was kind of starting with one shape, although the last hands I showed you that we'd done hands and scribbles and circles and everything, but here we're starting with a scribble. So this is an example of it's just, creating a scribble shape and letting it make curves and spaces and overlap. And then this was kind of, another stage along. So you can see I started filling in the shapes. So you can see this part here then becomes this part here. And then I added petals to it. Down here, I've got a big swoopy thing, and then I added leaves on top of it. This space at the top I decided looked kind of like a mountain. So I decided to make a mountain with a little sun, and then did some little birds. And you can see I did a little bit of pencil on top of it to kind of get my bearings on where I wanted things to be. And then when I went over it with ink, I wasn't really following the pencil exactly. It just kind of gave me a guideline. And then this is the final. So you can see this is where it started and this is where it ended. So the cool thing about scribbles is it gives you lots of areas. The more detailed your scribble is, the more spaces you've got to fill in, or you can just add shapes on top of it to give yourself spaces to fill in. So this is another example of a scribble. This was one that I did for my coloring book. And with the coloring book, I a lot of the pages, I created spaces to put in quotes, to add a quote to the page.
Mm.
So with this, I created this circle, and then I created a scribble on top, on top and around it, but left the circle open. So then you can see where I was, and with this scribble, I used a chisel point. So I used a thicker marker, which created some interesting shapes on the line. So with the chisel point, the lines aren't exactly even all the way around, as your hand is moving, parts of it, some of the line gets a little bit thinner, but I like that made it more interesting. So you can see this is thicker here than it is here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like
So I started filling in there and then scanned it. And then this is once the doodle was all finished. And then that's with the quote in place.
Mm.
So this is what actually printed in the coloring book. But what I had also done is, when I was doing this, I was teaching more of the classes then. And so I made this into a handout for my classes. And so this is an example of one of my students in the class, what she did when she filled it in, which I thought was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's a great way to start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Get a little
Well,
head
and
start.
a scribble is really easy because, it kind of is no pressure. You can just make a whole bunch of scribbly shapes and then start filling in the spaces that you have. And you can always add some other lines to make more spaces if you want.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So this is another example of a scribble. This was with a highlighter. It looks like I had done some sort of pencil lines. I think I was just trying to keep a little bit on that kind of, upper left to lower right kind of trajectory of the scribble shape. But I made the scribbles and then I started filling it in. And this one I decided you can see I started in with just, kind of blues and greens, but obviously I finished it with lots of colors. So you can see, you kind of don't even see the scribble so much once it's all put together.
Yeah.
But it's, you can make things that are really intricate, or you can make things that have more space to them. It's just up to you. So.
Hmm.
And then Mo, I thought you might be interested in this. So these are some examples of combining photos and doodles together.
Hmm.
So since you're a photographer, this might be something that you would have fun playing with. So this is kind of an analog version of it. So it's kind of more, when I did it, it was more showing an example of how to do a vision board and using combinations of pictures and doodles.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through some magazines and cut out pictures and found this cool headline that I thought was cool, Sweet Spot. So I cut out images and laid them on the paper and glued them down with glue stick, and then started drawing, some lines around it, started adding some circles with my little juice glass. And so this is the next, the next photo that I took. You can see I, took this little sun area and added some shapes around it, and then added another circle around it with some additional shapes, and just continued to add in around the background.
Mm.
And then this is the finished, where it was all filled in with doodles. So, that I could see where you could have fun with that, taking some of your photos and adding them to the page, either multiple pictures or one picture that then you add doodles along to that. So
That's a really cool idea.
It's fun.
Mm.
and then this was a vision board. A few years ago, I did kind of a multi-page vision board that was focused on business. And so this was a spread that was talking about design and writing. And so I had, found some words and some pictures that I thought were cool and this is construction paper. So I glued it onto the paper and then added some doodles just to make it feel more cohesive, to kind of tie in the writing part of my business with the design part of my business, and how it all, I felt like it kind of tied together, but just to visually make it more interesting too.
Mm.
So this was really just for me, it wasn't, it didn't go anywhere, but just for me, but it was fun to do.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the combinations that I've done have been more digital, because with my work, I use Photoshop. And so I thought, well, why not use that to combine some of the photos that I take when I'm out on my neighborhood walks and out
Mhm.
walking in the area, and combination with doodles. And so these are some examples of that. So this was a coloring page that was drawn a few years before I did this. So I had done this coloring page and I thought, well, this bird would be fun to do something with. So I silhouetted out the background and just used the bird, and then pulled out these pictures. So it was obviously in the spring. These were things in the neighborhood. This was a dogwood tree that I thought, was kind of cool. And then this pink dogwood. So what I did was used sections of these pictures, the petals and the leaves and stuff, to then fill in the bird. So you can see
Mm.
the
Oh, wow.
shapes inside the doodle. I've actually pasted the petals and the leaves, the photos of the petals and the leaves into all the shapes, and
Mm.
then tuck the bird into the dogwood photograph.
Mm.
That's so fun.
Mm. That's cool.
So it's cool with the photos because it gives all this cool texture that
Yeah.
would be really hard to achieve doing it manually. But digitally, it's really, it's fun to be able to, manipulate that and create some extra texture there.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was cool with the, of course, I
Oh,
thought the thing was cool. It was fun to do, but this was, that poppy. So you can see this area
Oh,
here.
yeah.
And then I did it right at her beak. So it made a cool kind of shape and texture right at the edge of her face.
Yeah.
It really gave her an expression.
I know it did.
Love it.
Mm.
And then here's another example of, this was a butterfly that I had taken at one of the parks nearby. And so I silhouetted around the background and, left the flower and the butterfly and dropped out the background, and then had a canvas that I had scanned that was, just a little canvas. And I loved the texture that the canvas gave it. And then had a doodle, which I like to reuse things. And I've done a lot of the doodles I do, I scan so that I can reuse them for something else. So this was actually part of one of the coloring pages from my coloring book.
Mm.
That I took a section of it and then layered it on top of the canvas, and then layered the butterfly and the
Wow.
petal on top of that. So,
Wow. Huh.
and then in my neighborhood, there's not right in my immediate neighborhood, but in the extended neighborhood, one of the places that I walk, this guy has this mop and broom couple that he dresses for the holidays. So whatever holidays coming up, he's dressed them for the holiday. So
I've
this
seen
was
them many times now. Yeah, you've
Oh,
shared
yeah.
these guys, in your walks. I
Oh,
love
that's
that.
hilarious.
yeah. And earlier this year, he had them with masks on, and so
Uh-huh.
I just think they're fun. But so this was a 4th of July. Obviously they were dressed for 4th of July. So I decided to drop out the background and make, kind of a patriotic background doodle.
Hmm.
So I had a doodle that I had done, and then inside the doodle, I layered a photograph of a flag that I had taken. So you can see, this texture is actually a close-up of a flag that was just dropped into the doodle, and then added some curves and some ivies and stuff in front. So I just thought it was fun. I just think they tickle me. I think they're just a fun couple, and I love to see them. So we're right at the end. So just a reminder of the 7 basic shapes: the circles and the ovals, squares and rectangles, triangles, leaves, hearts, paisley, and stars.
Hmm.
So all shapes that are really easy to draw. And then it's, working with the scribbles. So this was one that started with a scribble. And I love the reminder that creativity is rarely linear.
Hmm.
And so the idea that you can just start somewhere and see where it takes you, see where your imagination can take you as you add things onto it and expand from there.
Wonderful.
So I do have a Doodle Basic booklet that you can download for free. So if you go to this bit.ly/Doodle Basics book, so http // Doodle Basics book, then you can download it for free. So it has some of the things that a lot of the things that we talked about here with the basic shapes and some examples and that kind of thing. And then I also have some step-by-step doodle videos on my YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Vanessa Lowry. And you'll have to go to the videos, click on this videos. A lot of the more recent videos are of mostly photos that I've taken on my neighborhood walks. With some doodles thrown in. But further down on the list, there are several step-by-step video doodles. So
Nice.
and then, Mo and Heather, both of you are in the Art for 30 Days group. But for anybody that's watching this recording, if you want to share your creations and come to the Facebook group that's Art for 30 Days, I share a lot of my in-progress doodles and finished doodles there, and other people share things that they're creating. And so, and I love that you guys are already in the group. So
It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
yeah. So that's it. So thank you all for playing with me today.
Thank
Oh, I'm
you.
excited to try this out.
Heather already has a couple in progress that she's been working on. So that's really good. She's jumped right in.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm going to stop this share. So maybe I am.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was really fun.
Oh, I'm so glad that you all could join me. So thanks for being here. And Mo, we'll talk offline about the hands print, what you want to do with that. So
Okay, we will do that.
Thank you so much.
thanks. You all have a good evening.
You too. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.